Hi and welcome to Really Understanding Incoterms 2020, a series of comprehensive masterclasses. I'm Bob Ronai, and this is lesson number 4, the first of 2 parts on FCA free carrier, named place of delivery. But first, the necessary disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. The contents of this course are not legal advice. I was a member of the International Chamber of Commerce's Incoterms 2020 drafting group, which created these rules. Some of the contents in this lesson are direct quotes from the Incoterms 2020 publication, number 723E of the ICC. My explanations, my comments, and my opinions are based on my knowledge and my experience of over 5 decades. My intent in creating this comprehensive course on Incoterms 2020 is to ensure that my knowledge and my experience is passed on to you for a better future for you in trade. In this lesson, we will look specifically at FCA. The more complex and contentious articles, especially A2 and B2, delivery and taking delivery, with its 2 options, and A10 and B10 notices. Because there is so much to cover, we will then look at the strange A6 and B6, delivery and transport document, and A9 and B9, allocation of costs, in the next lesson. As always, I will explain what the book says first, which is where other trainers and YouTube videos usually stop if they go that far. But then I will examine the issues arising from these articles and explain them as we go along. A2, delivery. There are 3 parts to this article: delivery to whom, when, and how. The seller must deliver the goods to the carrier or another person nominated by the buyer at the named point, if any, at the named place, or procure goods so delivered. The seller must deliver the goods, 1, on the agreed date, or 2, at the time within the agreed period notified by the buyer under B10B, or 3, if no such time is notified, then at the end of the agreed period. Delivery is completed either A, if the named place is the seller's premises, then when the goods have been loaded on the means of transport provided by the buyer, or B, in any other case, when the goods are placed at the disposal of the carrier or another person nominated by the buyer on the seller's means of transport ready for unloading. If no specific point has been notified by the buyer under B10D within the named place of delivery, and if there are several points available, the seller may select the point that best suits its purpose. Now, as we've seen, there are 2 options for where delivery can occur. A, at the seller's premises, which would be usual for a forwarder arranging collection of cargo for LCL, air freight and rail, as well as FCLs. Or B, the seller taking its goods to the carrier's premises, ready for the carrier to unload them from the truck. Option A is the most common in practice, and delivery occurs the moment all of the goods are placed onto the truck. What does or procure goods so delivered mean? It refers to a string sale in which a first buyer then sells to the next buyer who becomes the second seller, and so on. What does the last paragraph If no such time is notified, then at the end of the agreed period mean? It means the seller will be deemed to have delivered at the end of the period if the buyer fails to give notice required in B10b, which we'll look at soon. This rule covers any mode or combinations of modes without attempting to detail them because they are largely irrelevant to the seller. For example, a truck from the seller to the airport, movement by ground equipment, then on the aircraft, by air to the destination airport, and reverse at the destination. Often the seller will not know in advance who the buyer is contracting as the carrier. Just a thing to consider, if the seller has multiple dispatches daily, this rule can cause some disruption to their business as they try to coordinate arrivals of trucks from various carriers. It's essential to understand that delivery does not mean shipment on board a vessel or on the aircraft. The seller has no responsibility as to when or how the goods are eventually shipped, or even if they are shipped on board. The seller has no control over the goods from the moment of delivery. As we saw in A3 and Lesson 2, risk of loss or damage to the goods transfers to the buyer at the moment of delivery, which under option A can be on the collecting vehicle still in the seller's premises. B2, taking delivery. Simply, the buyer must take delivery of the goods when they have been delivered under A2. This means that the buyer has taken delivery in the seller's country, maybe even while still on the collecting vehicle in the seller's premises, and maybe days before actual export. If something happens to the goods within the seller's country between delivery and going on the ship, the aircraft or the train, that is of no concern to the seller. A10 notices the seller must give the buyer sufficient notice, either that the goods have been delivered in accordance with A2, or that the carrier or another person nominated by the buyer has failed to take the goods within the time agreed. The buyer must notify the seller of A, the name of the carrier or another person nominated within sufficient time as to enable the seller to deliver the goods in accordance with A2. And B, the selected time, if any, within the period agreed for delivery when the carrier or person nominated will receive the goods. C, the mode of transport to be used by the carrier or the person nominated, including any transport-related security requirements. And D, the point where the goods will be received within the named place of delivery. Now, all this means is that even though the seller must give notice of delivery to the buyer, the reality is that the buyer would already know about it from its carrier because the buyer arranged it. The buyer must, logically, inform the seller who will collect the goods. The buyer or its carrier need to liaise with the seller as to a suitable time and date for collection of the goods in option A. And the buyer or its carrier need to inform the seller when and where to take the goods in option B. The buyer needs to inform the seller about the mode of transport so that it can suitably pack the goods and carry out export formalities, which we'll see in the next lesson. Indeed, the next lesson will continue with FCA. We will look at the interesting A6 and B6 delivery transport document and A9 and B9 allocation of costs. If you like this lesson, please click on the thumbs up button below. If you'd like to be alerted to each new lesson, please hit the subscribe button and the bell. And please leave any comments and questions relevant to this lesson below. Till next lesson.